December 1847, the Wyoming high country. A bitter wind, smelling of iron and distant ice, hammered the small cabin, scouring the log walls with a sound like tearing canvas. Inside, Silas Vane, a trapper and settler in his 40s, sat hunched on a three-legged stool, staring into the fire. He was not a small man, but the cold made him feel shrunken. His broad shoulders pulled in against the relentless chill. The fireplace was enormous, built of heavy river stone, wide enough to roast a deer. It was roaring, consuming seasoned pine logs at a terrifying rate, casting frantic, leaping shadows that made the single-room cabin feel vast and unstable. Yet Silas was freezing. The front of his wool shirt felt scorched, but his back, facing the cabin's west wall only 10 feet away, was numb. He could see his breath. In the corner, the water bucket, filled only 3 hours prior, had a thick collar of ice. The wind didn't just blow around the cabin. It blew through it, a dozen tiny, piercing shrieks that found every gap in the mud and grass chinking. This was the fundamental, terrifying flaw. The cabin was a sieve. The fire, meant to be his salvation, was actively trying to kill him. He watched the flames, mesmerizing and hungry, and understood the trap. The bigger the fire he built, the more powerful the updraft it created, and the more frigid, high-altitude air it violently sucked into the cabin through every crack. He was feeding the winter, inviting it inside just to watch his wood burn. His woodpile, the product of a full summer's labor, felling, bucking, hauling, splitting, was dwindling at a rate that chilled him more than the air. It was December. There were 4 more months of this at least. He rose, the joints in his knees cracking, and walked to the wall. The logs were solid, 14-inch lodgepole pine, saddle-notched as well as any man could do. But when he pressed his bare palm to the wood, it felt like holding a block of ice. The heat was simply passing through it, bleeding out into the wind. He looked back at the hearth, the massive stones around. The fire, the ones that formed the chimney breast, were barely even warm. All the heat, all his work was vanishing straight up into the black, howling sky. Everyone said this was the way. "Build a big fire," they'd told him. "A fireplace you can stand in." He had, and he was freezing to death. He was not just uncomfortable, he was in a battle of attrition he was certain to lose. Something was deeply, structurally wrong with the very idea of survival he had been sold. The cabin had been built in the spring of 1846, with the kind of desperate speed and conventional wisdom that marked most frontier construction. Silas Vane, like every other settler pushing into the territories, had followed the script. He'd found a stand of pine near a creek, felled the trees, and hauled them with his lone mule. He'd built it American style. This meant speed over precision and size over efficiency. The logs were notched quickly, leaving gaps that demanded gallons of chinking. The roof was a shallow pitch, covered in shakes split from cedar, designed to be built fast, not to hold the crushing weight of a high-country snowpack. But the centerpiece, the symbol of security, was the fireplace. It was a monument to brute force. He and the mule had dragged nearly 4 tons of stone from the riverbed, stacking them with a mud and sand mortar against the cabin's north-facing gable end. The rules were simple. The firebox had to be huge, the throat wide, and the chimney tall to draw well. It certainly drew. It drew so well that on still nights he could hear the air whistling under the door, a low moan as the cabin inhaled the cold. The structure wasn't a shelter, it was a bellows. In his first winter he had nearly perished. He'd spent his days hunting not for meat, but for wood, and his nights feeding the fire, sleeping in fits, waking every hour to find the flames dying and the cold creeping into his blankets. He had piled snowdrifts against the walls as high as he could, a desperate attempt at insulation. It helped, slightly, but the snow just melted and refroze, turning the ground around his foundation into a treacherous slick of ice. He had re-chinked the walls twice, using precious animal fat mixed with clay, but the wind always found a new way in, or the logs shrank in the dry air, opening new fissures. He was exhausted, his hands split and raw from the axe handle. He felt a quiet rage building, a frustration not at the land, which was only being itself, but at the sheer, stunning stupidity of the design. Why did everyone build this way? Why did they build a machine to steal their own warmth? He remembered sitting there, shivering, watching the last of his autumn-cut wood burn, calculating that he would have to start cutting green, frozen wood by February, a back-breaking task that yielded little heat and vast amounts of creosote. This was not living. This was a slow-motion catastrophe. The cabin, which had cost him a season of his life, was a failure. It was wrong. It was a trap, and the fire was the bait. He realized that the common wisdom was designed for a different place, for the hardwood forests of Ohio or Kentucky, where the wood was plentiful and the winters were mild. Here at 8,000 feet, that design was a death sentence. That spring, Silas Vane did not repair his cabin. He left it as it was, a cold reminder, and traveled. He was trading his winter pelts, but he was truly hunting for an idea. He went south, into the lower valleys where small, insular communities of immigrants had settled. He sought out the Germans, the Swedes, the Finns, people who came from lands where winter was not a visitor, but a tyrant. He found his answer in a small, tidy settlement near a tributary of the Platte River, in the home of a man named Jacob Hess. Hess was an old man, a carpenter and mason from the Black Forest who had come to America with his sons. Silas arrived on a cool April evening and was invited inside. The difference was immediate and profound. Hess's home was not hot, but it was warm. It was an even, penetrating, silent warmth that filled the entire two-room house. The air was still. There were no drafts. Silas looked for the source and saw no roaring fireplace. In the center of the main room, connecting the kitchen and the living space, stood a massive, beautiful structure of plastered clay and tile, rising from floor to ceiling. It was a Kachelofen, a tile stove. A small, cast-iron door near the bottom was cool to the touch. "Where is your fire?" Silas asked. Jacob smiled, his face a map of wrinkles. He tapped the plastered surface of the stove. "In here," he said. "The stone holds it." He explained in patient, accented English, a principle that shattered everything Silas thought he knew about heat. "You," Jacob said, gesturing broadly, "build a Lagerfeuer, a bonfire, in your house. It burns the wood, it burns the air, and it all goes up the chimney. It is dumb, stupid." He pointed to his stove. "This is not a fire. This is a trap for the heat." He explained that you did not heat the air, which was a fickle guest that left the moment a door was opened. You heated the mass. "The stone," he said, patting the stove again. "The stone is loyal. It holds the heat and gives it back to you, slow, all day, all night." He described the inside, not a straight shot to the sky, but a labyrinth. The fire was small, but it burned incredibly hot and fast in a tiny, ceramic-lined box. The smoke and hot gases, instead of escaping, were forced to travel a long serpentine path, up, then down, then sideways, through channels within the stove's massive body, before finally exiting. By the time the smoke left the chimney, it was cool. All its energy, all its fire, had been given to the tons of stone and clay. "I make one fire," Jacob said, holding up a finger. "One small fire in the morning, then I close it. The stone does the work for 20 hours. Silas also learned from the land. He watched how the south-facing slopes held warmth, how a badger's den, dug deep into the earth, maintained a constant temperature. He felt the sun-baked granite of the high peaks radiating heat long after sunset. The lesson was the same: mass, insulation, and a smart path for the heat. He returned to his cabin in late summer, a new resolve hardening in him. He would not just rebuild, he would reimagine. Silas spent the dwindling days of summer not cutting wood, but gathering stone and clay. He sat by his cold, useless hearth at night, sketching on a piece of smooth slate, designing his new engine. He could not build a tiled cachalophan. He had no glazed tiles, no ceramic firebricks. He would build his own version, a Rocky Mountain adaptation, a masonry heater made of the materials the land gave him. His list of problems was long. The new stove had to be airtight. It had to have a small, incredibly hot firebox. It had to have a complex internal flue system, and it had to have mass. Tons of it. He began to plan obsessively. He would not build it on the gable end, where it would lose half its heat to the outside world. He would build it in the very center of the cabin, where it would radiate warmth in all 360 degrees, becoming the heart of the home. This meant he would have to tear down the old chimney, patch the wall, and re-engineer his roof to accommodate a new, much smaller chimney pipe. He spent a week just finding the right clay, digging by the creek bed, mixing samples with sand and pulverized stone, firing them in his outdoor cook fire to see if they cracked. He needed a mortar that could withstand thermal shock, expanding and contracting without crumbling. He found a good vein of blue clay and hauled hundreds of pounds of it back to the cabin. He selected his stones with the care of a jeweler. He needed flat, dense stones for the flue paths and massive, heavy boulders for the outer core. His most prized possession was a single, enormous slab of soapstone he had found years ago, smooth and grey-green. It was soft enough to work, but held heat better than granite. This would be the top of the stove, his cooking surface and primary radiator. His neighbour, a grizzled trapper named McRae, who lived 5 miles down the valley, stopped by. He saw the dismantled hearth, the pile of rocks and clay in the centre of the cabin, and shook his head. "You've lost your mind, Vane," McRae said, spitting tobacco. "A cold chimney in the middle of the room. It'll never draw. You'll fill the place with smoke and die in your sleep. Just build a bigger fireplace, like a sensible man." Silas just nodded, his hands caked in dried clay. "Maybe," he said. The risk was enormous. If he built it wrong, if the flue dimensions were off, McRae would be right. It wouldn't draw. It would be a cold, monolithic tomb in the middle of his only shelter, and winter was coming. The work began in September. The air was already crisp, a daily reminder that his deadline was absolute. First, he demolished the old fireplace and chimney, a brutal, dusty job that left a gaping wound in his north wall. He patched it with the best logs he had, chinking them tightly. Then he dug down. The new stove would weigh over 3 tons. He had to reinforce the floor, digging a deep foundation pit, filling it with gravel and large stones to create a solid, stable base that wouldn't heave in the frost. Then he began to build upward, layer by layer, like a man solving a puzzle in 3 dimensions. The firebox was the most critical part. He built it small and deep, lining it with his best fireclay mixture. He salvaged the heavy iron door from an old prospecting stove to make it airtight. Above the firebox he built a throat that led not to a chimney, but to the labyrinth. This was the secret. He laid his flat stones with painstaking care, creating a serpentine channel. The hot gas would be forced to travel up one side, across the top, down the other side, and then back up a central flue before it could escape. The path was nearly 20 feet long, all of it contained inside the heater's mass. He was creating a giant stone radiator, and the smoke was the hot water. He used his smoothest stones for the inside of the flues, mortaring every joint to ensure it was smoke-tight. His knuckles were raw, his back in agony. He worked by the light of a tallow candle long after the sun went down, the smell of damp clay filling the cabin. McRae visited again, saw the complex twisting channels, and laughed. "That's a badger's den, not a chimney. A squirrel could get lost in there." Silas ignored him, his focus total. He encased the entire internal labyrinth in a thick, solid shell of his heaviest fieldstones, carefully mortared. Finally, he wrestled the massive soapstone slab into place on top. It was done. It was not beautiful. It was a massive, utilitarian block of stone and clay, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 5 feet high. It dominated the small cabin. It looked ancient, primal. He had to let the clay mortar cure. For 3 weeks, he lived in the cabin with his dead cold monument as the temperatures dropped below freezing. He survived on his small cook fire, his anxiety growing. Had he built a massive, useless rock? The first great blizzard of the season arrived in mid-November. It came on suddenly, a wall of white that erased the world. The wind shrieked, a high-pitched, maddening sound. This was the test. McRae was in his own cabin, furiously feeding his massive, inefficient fireplace. Silas Vane stood before his creation, his hands trembling slightly. He had a small pile of his driest, split aspen. He opened the small iron door and laid the wood inside the deep firebox. It was a fraction of what he used to burn in an entire hour. He lit the kindling. He watched, holding his breath. The smoke filled the firebox, hesitated. And then with a soft whoosh, the draft caught. A low, intense roar began, the sound of a forge. It was burning far hotter and faster than his old fire ever had. This was the hot, fast burn Jacob Hess had described. The wood was consumed in a blinding, white-hot flame. After 90 minutes, the entire load of wood was gone, reduced to a small pile of white ash. The roar subsided. Following Jacob's instructions, Silas closed the airtight firebox door and the small damper plate on the chimney pipe, sealing the entire system. The fire was out. The cabin fell silent, save for the screaming wind outside. At first, nothing. The stone was still cool. He felt a spike of panic. Had the heat all escaped? Had he failed? He touched the stone again. Barely warm, he paced the cabin. The wind was relentless. An hour passed. He put his palm on the soapstone slab. It was no longer cool. It was deeply, astonishingly hot, but not hot enough to burn. It was a pleasant, radiating heat. 2 hours. The entire mass was now a solid block of warmth, a gentle, steady, penetrating warmth spread through the cabin. It wasn't the scorching directional heat of the old fire. It was a stable ambient heat, as if the sun itself were in the room. He walked to the far corners. They were comfortable. He checked the water bucket. The ice was melting. Night fell. The blizzard raged, temperatures plummeting to 20 below zero. Silas lay in his bedroll. He was not huddled. He was not shivering. He was perfectly evenly warm. He fell asleep, a deep, restorative sleep, for the first time in a winter. He woke 6 hours later, in the dark. The cabin was still warm. The wind still howled, but inside there was only stillness. The stone mass was still radiating its stored energy. He had not added a single stick of wood. He had done it. When the storm finally broke 3 days later, the world was buried in white. Silas Vane emerged from his cabin, rested and fed. His woodpile looked almost untouched. He walked the 5 miles to McRae's cabin. He found the trapper haggard, his eyes bloodshot, slumped at his table. McRae's cabin was frigid, the fire reduced to embers. His woodpile was decimated. The wind nearly took the roof. McRae croaked, exhausted from 3 days of fighting the cold. "You look rested," he said, eyeing Silas with suspicion. Silas nodded. "Come see what I've built." McRae followed him back, skeptical and weary. He stepped inside Silas's cabin and stopped dead. The warmth hit him like a blanket. It was deep, silent, and even. He looked around, confused. "But where's the fire?" he asked. "There's no smoke." Silas just walked over and placed his hand on the massive stone heater. It was still pulsing out warmth more than 12 hours after its last firing. McRae touched it, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My God, Vane," he whispered, "it's a hot rock." McRae was the first convert. That spring, Silas helped him build a Vane heater, as McRae called it. The next year, a family of settlers, broken and desperate after a hard winter in a standard cabin, stayed with Silas for a week. They sketched the design, memorized the principles, and took the idea with them to the Oregon Territory. The innovation spread, not like wildfire, but slowly, person to person, a secret handshake among those who had to survive the high country's worst. They adapted it. Some built with brick scavenged from old forts, others used river rock and a clay-lime plaster. But the core principles remained: the small, hot firebox, the long, winding smoke path, and the massive, heat-storing mass. It was never the common way. It was too slow to build, too complex for men in a hurry. But in the harshest valleys, the slow heat stoves became the mark of a serious builder, a man who planned to stay. In the brutal, hard winter of 1851, stories trickled back of settlers with standard fireplaces who froze or who burned their own furniture and wagon beds just to see the dawn. But the families with the masonry heaters endured, their cabins islands of stable warmth, their woodpiles lasting the season. Silas Vane, without formal training, had intuitively mastered 3 complex principles of thermodynamics. The first was complete combustion. The American fireplace was an inefficient, oxygen-starved fire that wasted most of its fuel as smoke. Silas's small, airtight firebox, drawing air through a small vent, created a miniature inferno. It reached temperatures so high it achieved secondary combustion, burning not just the wood, but the flammable gases in the smoke itself, releasing nearly every calorie of energy the wood possessed. The second principle was heat exchange. In a standard chimney, that superheated gas, energy, was shot into the sky at hundreds of degrees. Silas's serpentine flue, the labyrinth, was a highly efficient heat exchanger. It forced those hot gases to take a long, slow journey, scrubbing them against the internal stones, transferring their energy to the masonry. By the time the exhaust left his chimney, it was barely warm, all its power captured. The final and most important principle was thermal mass. The 4-ton heater acted as a thermal battery. It stored the immense, short-lived energy of that 90-minute fire and then radiated it slowly and evenly over the next 12, 18, or even 24 hours. He was no longer heating the air in the cabin, a fickle guest that fled at every opportunity. He was heating the objects, the walls, the floor, the furniture, and the people, with gentle infrared waves. The cabin became a stable, comfortable environment, not a desperate battleground between a scorching fire and an icy draft. It was the fundamental difference between brute force and intelligent design, between waste and efficiency. Silas Vane lived in that cabin for another 30 years. He watched the territory become a state, watched the railroad cut through valleys that had once known only game trails. His design was never adopted by the masses. The arrival of cheap cast-iron stoves, which heated up fast and cooled down faster and still consumed wood at a steady rate, made his slow-built, massive heaters seem like relics. But Silas never wavered. He would teach the occasional newcomer, the ones who seemed to listen, how to fire the stove. "You don't fight the winter," he'd say, his hand resting on the warm soapstone slab, which was now dark and polished from decades of use. "You can't. You invite the fire's ghost to stay with you." When he passed, the cabin eventually fell into disuse. The roof collapsed under a heavy snow 2 decades later, and the log walls slowly rotted back into the earth. But hikers and hunters in the 20th century would often find it, a strange, massive stone block standing alone in a clearing, a monument to a forgotten idea, still solid, still waiting for a fire. Silas Vane's heater was a statement. The standard American fireplace was built on an assumption of endless abundance. It was a symbol of consumption, glorious and wasteful. Silas's heater was built on an understanding of limits. It was a symbol of conservation, humble and wise. He had learned what the frontier, in its harsh beauty, always teaches. Survival is not a measure of how much energy you can command, but of how much you can steward. The greatest innovations are often not new inventions, but the patient rediscovery of a truth. We are not defined by the size of the fire we build, but by the intelligence of its design and the purpose it serves. The challenge is not to conquer the environment, but to build a life that is worthy of its stark realities, to find a way to trap the heat and hold it long after the flames have died.